Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our October armchair travel event, where we're going to be taking a tour of the vanishing kingdoms of the Himalayas. I'm Christine Fairchild, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations here at Oxford. And this event is hosted by Distant Horizons, the company that's arranging the tour to Bhutan in September 2022, titled The Kingdom of Bhutan Walks and Festivals, that will be led by freelance art historian Zara Fleming, who's with us today. And perhaps some of you are thinking about joining the tour and you're keen to have a preview, but perhaps others of you have been to Bhutan and want to be reminded of her rich culture and stunning landscape. But whatever your reasons for being here, we're really delighted to have you. It's such an exciting thing to see over 300 people on a call like this. Just to remind you, all of these travel events are indeed recorded, including this one. And if you've missed any of the events that we've held previously, they can all be found on both the Oxford and the Cambridge alumni websites under the events section of our websites. But now it's my pleasure to hand things over to Daniel Moore from Distant Horizons. Daniel, over to you.
Christine, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Daniel Moore. I help manage the cultural travel company Distant Horizons. We specialize in scholar-accompanied journeys to really all parts of Asia, or most parts of Asia, should I say, North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. We try and focus on destinations which are perhaps slightly less visited than others, and we also try and include some special experiences or extra experiences that may allow the traveler to get under the skin of the country. These might be things like briefings and lectures from local academics, from local experts, visits to private art collections, meals in private homes, and where possible, food and wine tastings. We've been working with the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge for over 20 years now. And in that time, we've organized well over 300 journeys for the alumni. That's probably perhaps enough about Distant Horizons. Just a couple of practical points. We definitely encourage questions, so please ask as many questions as you can, but please use the chat box, and hopefully we'll have time at the end of the lecture to address some of these questions. If you may permit me just a couple of minutes to canter through some of the journeys that Oxford and Cambridge are planning over the next 18 months or so. We have a journey to Central Asia, accompanied by Professor Charles Melville of Pembroke College in Cambridge. This will travel into the heart of Central Asia to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and it traces a Silk Road route through some of the major medieval cities of the time, places like Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva. Later on in the year, Professor Jay Lewis of Oxford University will be accompanying the alumni party to Japan. This will focus on some of the major cultural and historical sites of Japan's main island, Honshu Island. A journey that we've been organizing pretty much every year for the last 10 years now, in the winter months particularly, is to St. Petersburg. And this is accompanied by Professor Alexei Laporte, who's a curator of Western European art at the Hermitage Museum. We like to do this in the winter because that's the time when the crowds are gone, the theatres are open, the buildings are still kept cozy and warm, and the city has a real Russian feel to it. But perhaps most importantly, it's a time when the galleries, the museums, and 2 visits to the Hermitage are planned for the trip are delightfully empty. And that's a real bonus, bearing in mind the quality of the collections in the city. We also have a journey to Romania. Now, this will involve 5 or 6 days of walking in the Carpathian Mountains in northeast Transylvania, which is an area of incredible scenic beauty, but also a cultural treasure trove. And a particular highlight is some exquisitely painted monasteries which speckle the countryside there. And that's led by Dr. Alex Koller, who incidentally has just returned from a trip to Romania with the alumni. It's one of the few alumni journeys that went or was organized this year. And finally, and as Christine has mentioned, Zara will be taking a trip to Bhutan. And like Romania, this will involve a few days of walking, relatively easy to moderate walking at relatively low altitude. But this will allow the party to visit and some more remote sites, which aren't included in many itineraries. The itinerary also takes in a couple of wonderful and very colourful festivals in Bhutan, and these can be the high points, or some of the high points, not just cultural high points, but social high points for the Bhutanese. I should say a lot of these trips have limited places, partly because we postponed them from last year. So if they are of interest, it might be worth contacting us as soon as possible. And there's the information, there's an email address and the website, and there's details of other trips that we're organizing. And any trips that are of interest, we'd be very happy to send a full in-depth itinerary of the trip, which will have details of sightseeing, restaurants, hotels, etc. Anyway, enough of the promo. If I can now hand over to Zara, and I've known Zara probably for more years than we both care to remember. But Zara has been accompanying alumni trips to the Himalayas for probably 15 years or so. And in that time, I think has done about 12 or 13 trips. So anyway, over to Zara to tell us more about the vanishing kingdoms of the Himalayas.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Bear with me a second and I'll be with you. And it's a very great pleasure to be with you today to talk to you about the Himalayas, or what I should really correctly call by its Sanskrit term, Himalaya, which means abode of the snow. But of course, it wasn't always like this. It used to be covered by a giant ocean, the Sea of Tethys. But what happened some 50 million years ago was that immense pressure built up underneath the South Indian landmass, forcing the whole area northwards, creating the folds of the Himalayas and the vast plateau of Tibet beyond. It is the youngest and highest mountain range in the world, and to us, a mountaineer's paradise. But to some of the people that live within its shadows, particularly the Hindus and the Buddhists, it has been sacred since time immemorial, and they call it the land of the gods. So what we're going to be doing today is focusing on the former kingdoms that lie along the Tibetan border with Buddhist populations: Ladakh, Zanskar, Lahoul, Spiti, Mustang, here, Sikkim, and the only remaining kingdom of Bhutan. What shaped and inspired their culture and their art? And are the different characteristics of the various areas? And will Bhutan survive as a kingdom? And in order to answer this, we're going to look at their faith, and then I'm going to transport you from Ladakh all the way to Bhutan. But first, I think what has really shaped their culture in this part of the world is the diversity of their landscape, ranging from the grasslands and high altitude desert of the west to the more fertile and temperate areas of the east. And it's a place where people work extremely hard to scratch a living. And they, of course, they are prone to very severe weather and things like avalanches and landslides and earthquakes. So it's hardly surprising, really, that the people of this area have developed a very profound system of beliefs in order to cope with the harsh environment in which they live. And prior to the introduction of Buddhism across the Himalayas, all these areas believed in a religion called Bon and a form of animism, both of which relied heavily on nature worship. They believed the whole landscape was sacred and the deities of the mountains and lakes should be worshipped or placated as such. And when Buddhism came along, rather than expel these indigenous deities, they were absorbed into the Buddhist pantheon, like Peha, whom you see here on the right. And one characteristic of Buddhism is that it's always absorbed the indigenous faith. And they have always lived in harmony with the environment. And this has carried on today with their Buddhist faith. Now, Buddhism, as you know, started in the 5th, 6th century BC with Siddhartha, who was a royal prince, who after he became enlightened was known as the Buddha or the awakened one. And over the centuries, it developed into 3 main types. all share the same goal, to eliminate suffering and attain enlightenment. But they vary slightly in their approach. The Theravada, the oldest, well, originally called Hinayana, focuses on enlightenment of the individual. But both the Mahayana and the Vajrayana focus on enlightenment for all. And the Vajrayana in particular follows the teachings of the Buddhist Tantra and employs more yoga and meditation techniques. And it was these two later traditions that spread to the Himalayas and Tibet, and they traveled along the ancient trade routes that had for centuries crisscrossed this part of the world, particularly going up from Kashmir to Tibet and to the Silk Road, and also coming down from the Silk Road itself and going up from Kathmandu. And as well as the merchants traveling these routes, so too did pilgrims who carried with them treasures from their Buddhist homelands. And this undoubtedly had a great effect on the art of the Himalayas and indeed of Tibet. Now, Tibet, before it became part of China, occupied a vast area the size of Western Europe. And during the 7th century, it was an incredibly powerful empire that owned vast tracts of China and Central Asia. And it was through her military conquests and her trading activities that she came into contact with Buddhism. And the man responsible for introducing Buddhism into Tibet was the 33rd Emperor Songtsen Gampo, who's seen here with 2 of his wives. Now, this is important because one wife came from China and the other came from Nepal. And both these countries were already Buddhist. So they helped their husband introduce Buddhism into his empire. But it didn't really become established until the arrival of the great tantric Buddhist teacher from India, Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche, who was invited to Tibet to really quell the demons hostile to Buddhism. And he was also partly responsible for helping to construct Tibet's first monastery at Samye, which was built on the concept of a mandala, or sacred geometric diagram. Now, in the 9th century, the Tibetan Empire collapses and the focus of the ruling elite and of Buddhism moved to the west of Tibet, to an area known as Guge. And Guge is renowned for the most famous pilgrimage mountain in this part of the world, Mount Kailash, not only sacred to Buddhists, but also to Hindus, to Jains, and to the pre-Buddhist religion of Bon. Now, the ruler of Guge, who was a descendant of the royal family, in the 10th, 11th century, he was the ruler here, but it also, Guge at that time also included Ladakh, Zanskar, Lahu, and Spiti. And it's said that he built 108 temples to the glory of Buddhism. And this is one of them at a place called Saparang, which sadly was very badly destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. And when he was organizing the building of these monasteries, he invited 33 monk artists from Kashmir who were renowned for their artistic and sculptural abilities. And so this black and white photograph that you see on the right, taken in the 1940s, because so much of Saparang is now destroyed, shows the sculptural style at that time, which is very typically Kashmiri and Indian iconography. Now, by the 12th, 13th century, Islam has invaded India and they have destroyed every vestige of the Buddhist faith in its homeland. And the net result of this is that scores of monks and missionaries and teachers travel north to the Himalayas and to Tibet to be free to practice their religion. And we have the 4 main schools of Tibetan Buddhism that start at this time, and also the concept of the Lama, or spiritual guide, which you don't find in Tibetan Buddhism, and what we call tulku. Now, tulku means somebody who is already enlightened, who can come back on this earth in order to help others, and who can choose the exact time and place of their rebirth. Now, there are several hundreds of these right the way across the Himalayas, but probably the most famous in the West is His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, who left his homeland after the Chinese communists moved in and today lives in India. But these lamas and tulkus have all been very instrumental in spreading Buddhism right the way across the Himalayas. Now I'm going to transport you from Ladakh to Bhutan. Starting in Ladakh, a high altitude desert on the borders with Tibet, once part of the Tibetan Empire, and then a kingdom in its own right from the 11th to the 19th century. And then it became part of British India. But this area here, the Aksai Chin, was fought over by China in 1962. And so they now own the Aksai Chin. And you might remember last year, there were skirmishes on the border here between Chinese and Indian soldiers. The capital has changed in Ladakh. It used to be, today it is in Leh. And sometimes there was not only just one king, but two kings. And there is still a royal family, albeit dormant. Now, the people of Ladakh, it's a multi-ethnic community because you have Muslims, you have Christians, you have Dards, and you have Mons. And of course, you also have Buddhists. Now, the Buddhist population in Ladakh are believed to be descendants from the nomadic stock of Tibet, who came down here over the centuries. They're dressed in a similar way to Tibetans, but they wear a sort of chuba, which they call a goncho, 3/4 length, jaunty hat. And the women wear these rather beautiful black velvet dresses, especially at times of festivities, and these wonderful headdress called the perak, which are normally studded with turquoise and coral. And these are both auspicious stones, and the turquoise in particular has a medicinal property to purify the liver. Now, Leh itself, here we can see a Leh fort, which has dominated the area since the early 17th century. And interestingly, this building was built prior to the Potala Palace in Lhasa. And people often think that the Potala Palace was the first one of this kind, but it is predated by the 9-story palace in Leh. But Leh was always a very important staging post on the trade routes going up from Kashmir to Kashgar and the Silk Road. And of course, this is the area, or this is the route that Buddhism first entered Ladakh. And it came from Kashmir. So the earliest art styles are from Kashmir, which is a very flourishing center of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, renowned for its scholarship. So here on the left, you see a very typical Kashmiri bronze, of a crown Buddha, tripartite crown, quite broad shoulders, narrow waist, and quite pronounced knees. And this is very much the Kashmir style. Meanwhile, what you find in Ladakh is carvings of Buddhas out of the rocks, rock carvings of Buddhas, and very much in the same Kashmiri style, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and again, the knobbly knees. Now, this was probably made by the Kashmiri monks on their way up to Gugge, but no doubt aided by Ladakhi artists and craftsmen. And this brings to mind also, I've just put in the corner here, the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were built in the 6th century, but very similar in style, and that were destroyed so, tragically by the Taliban in 2001. Now, in Ladakh itself, some of the earliest temples are Kashmiri inspired, like Alchi, which is an absolute jewel. And I was lucky enough to visit here in 1976, before it was really on the map. Today it's protected by UNESCO, but it is typical Kashmiri style. Classical columns, triangular pediments, and these trefoil arches, which all originally come from Gandhara, what we call Afghanistan, and then moved to Kashmir, and then up to Ladakh. And inside, it is an absolute riot of colour with these beautiful murals, which we believe are very much in the Kashmiri style. This figure of green Tara. And here, if you look closely, I just want to show you the one of the horsemen. I'm just going to zoom in a minute. But the textiles show that there is much more influence than just Kashmir. Here you have one particular costume, which is from Central Asia, here another from Central Asia, and here a tie-dye from Tibet. And another characteristic of this type of painting is that you often find that the eye protrudes from the side profile. And I wish now that I'd taken more photographs, but at the time I didn't realize that you would never be able to take photographs inside Alchi again. But there are still some very interesting places in Ladakh to be discovered. In 2015, I was told of a rock cliff temple, and I clambered up here and found inside paintings dating from probably the 13th century, still in this early style. And today, this is another place that's on the tourist map. So it's always worth going into these caves. But although the Buddhism originally came from Kashmir, what happens from the 15th century onwards is Buddhist influence comes down from Tibet. And then the monasteries become much more Tibetan in style, built on cliff tops, partly for defense, with slightly inwardly sloping walls. And you have all four schools of Tibetan Buddhism represented. We now move into Zanskar, much more remote than Ladakh, again, originally part of the Tibetan Empire, then a kingdom in its own right, and then part of Ladakh, and then in the 19th century, absorbed into British India. And so occasionally also there were two kings in Zanskar. Now, when I first went there, there were no roads. You had to walk in over passes of 18,000 feet or more. And actually traveling at any time in Zanskar can be hazardous with many rivers to cross, either in boxes like this or on the back of inflated buffaloes. Or if you're incredibly brave, you can walk along the river in the winter because this area is frozen for 6 or 7 months a year. And so you walk on the frozen river bed. Just the same as Ladakh, the people are predominantly of Tibetan stock and very devout. You find them wherever you go. In fact, this is the same right the way across the Himalayas, spinning their prayer wheels, telling the beads in their rosaries, and chanting the mantra of compassion, Om Mani Padme Hum. And the monasteries in Zanskar, some are cave-like, which predate the Tibetan influence, like this one here at Phuktal. And of course, what you have right the way across the Himalayas is the tradition that one son or daughter from every monastery or from every family should enter a monastery or a nunnery. And this gave them a very good education and was a benefit to their family. And one of the first things that had to happen when Buddhism first spread into the Himalayas was that the Sanskrit texts had to be translated into Tibetan. So here we have a 14th century text written in Tibetan and illustrated, and it's actually made on the bark of the Daphne tree, which has been dyed black. But like now we move into Lahoul. I'm sorry, it is quite a gallop across the Himalayas. We move into Lahoul, which, as we have seen earlier, like Spiti, was originally part of the kingdom of Gugay. And then from the 13th century, it was ruled over by a member of the Ladakhi royal family, and later in the 19th century, part of British India. Here we have the Gondola Fort, which is where whoever was the ruler of Lahoul lived. And Lahoul is important because it is on yet another trade route. And this is the route up which Padmasambhava, the Tantric Buddhist master, is believed to have traveled to Tibet. And today this route is very much in use. And here we have the nomadic Gadi shepherds coming down to lower ground. Now Spiti borders onto Lahoul, exactly the same, originally part of the Tibetan Empire, and then a principality, and then part of British India. But Spiti is very interesting because it was here that King Yeshi-O also built temples and monasteries. So right from the 10th century, you have these rather amazing temples. And the Dalai Lama quite often visits Ladakh. He has a what we call his summer palace there, and he has done many teachings up here at Tabo. And inside Tabo, you do find again some early murals with Kashmiri influence, like you see here, the broad shoulders and the narrow waist. And so even though it was influenced by Kashmir and then by Tibet, Ladakh also has a very interesting culture, which I might tell you about another time, which is the Islamic element. But we now, oh sorry, there's one more thing here. The monasteries again from the 15th century are built more in Tibetan style. And the costume, very similar to what one finds in Ladakh, with the studded headdress or perak, and these shawls, which is known as lungsa, which today are used, woven with synthetic dyes. And the socks on the right, knitting and the patterns were introduced originally by the Moravian Christian missionaries in the 19th century. And there's still an active Moravian community in this part of the world. We now move into Nepal, the only former Hindu kingdom along the Himalayas. The last king, Gyanendra, was deposed in 2008, and the population, the 90% of the population in Nepal are Hindu, but Buddhism has always been greatly respected here because it was here that the historical Buddha was born, at Lumbini. So you find many early Buddhist historical monuments, such as these two stupas, Bodhnath and Swayambu. And the Nepali characteristic of a stupa is that they have the all-seeing eye that looks out in all four directions. And underneath what looks like a question mark is actually the Nepali figure for one, which indicates unity or the interdependence of all things, which is so important in Buddhism. Now, Nepal wasn't unified until the 18th century, and what was called Nepal prior to that was just the Kathmandu Valley. And the indigenous inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley are the Newas, who speak a Tibetan dialect. They're a mixture of Hindus and Buddhists, and their Buddhism, although Vajrayana, is slightly different to what you find in what I call Tibetan Buddhism. They read the texts in Sanskrit and they don't have the same monastic system. But they are outstanding artists and craftsmen, as we can see here in the temple struts from a pagoda temple dated to the 8th, 9th century. This extraordinary understanding of the human figure and the beautiful details that you find with the fruit and the foliage, the headdress, the beading on the headdress, even the patterning on their lungi, and this sort of Greek key pattern, which is an illustration of the Himalayas. Now, with Buddhist art, although it's always there as a focus of faith, Buddhist art is also used as spiritual tools for meditation and visualization. And because of that, it has to follow the Buddhist texts precisely as to the laws of iconometry, that is the mathematical proportions for each figure, and iconography, whether the figure is seated or sitting, what the attributes are, what the hand gestures or mudras are, and it is even color coded. So it's a very prescribed art, otherwise it won't work in meditation. And once a sculpture or a painting has been completed, it has to be consecrated. Now with a sculpture, and these are mainly made by the lost wax process, so are hollow, they put what they call a life force stick up the center, and then they pack tiny rolls of prayers all around the base and through the body. And then the sculpture is sealed and can be put on the altar. Meanwhile, with the paintings or the tankas, they normally put what we call seed syllables on the reverse, Om, Ah, Hum. This particular one has a stupa drawn on the reverse with a dedication prayer. And also, probably an important lama has put his handprints on the back. and then the object is blessed for use. But they were very, very fine artists and craftsmen in the Kathmandu Valley. And these two pieces from the 13th century really display the sort of quality that they could do. Here with this beautiful 13th century sculpture of Padmapan, you can see the details of the costume, of the jewelry, of the lotus base. And on the right, this painting here is believed to be by an artist called Aniko, who with his atelier went up to work in Tibet, and they were renowned throughout Asia. And so they were even responsible for decorating Kublai Khan's palaces. And if you look at the quality of the painting, it shows again the same understanding of the human figure, dated to the 13th century. This is the throne of the six perfections, and the details all around of the sort of trees that grow in the Kathmandu Valley and around. So they were very proficient artists, and indeed still are today. And what has really helped in Nepal, the Buddhism in Nepal, is the number of Tibetans that have escaped over the mountains after the Chinese occupation of their country. And this has given a tremendous boost to the art, to the Buddhist art of the Kathmandu Valley. And this final piece is of the Buddha as a young man. It was completed in 2001, but it shows their supreme skill in metalwork. And very sadly, during the 2015 earthquake, the monastery was destroyed, and so too was this beautiful bronze sculpture. Now, most of the north of Nepal is also Buddhist, Humla, Dolpo, Manang, and the Everest area. But we're just going to focus on the one former kingdom of Mustang, which you can see here, which is known as Lo, which literally means land to the south of Tibet. Again, originally part of the Tibetan Empire, and then it became a kingdom with the warrior king Amepal, who united the area in the 14th century. And then in 1789, it was absorbed into Nepal. But because of its geographical inaccessibility, it was left virtually undisturbed until the 20th century, and indeed quite late on into the 20th century. Now, the actual area of Mustang it lies along the old salt route that went up from India through Nepal up to the salt lakes of Tibet. And salt was an incredibly valuable commodity in those days. And indeed, these salt lakes are still very valuable because the Chinese have discovered that they are sources of lithium for mobile phones and all sorts of other things like that. But what happened is that salt and wool came down on this route from Tibet, and going back the other way went rice, spices, and textiles. And what Amepal and successive kings did was to tax the traders who passed through this area. And this brought immense wealth, which they used to construct Buddhist monasteries. The people of the area are known as the Lopas, or the people of Lo. They dress in a similar sort of Tibetan way with the striped apron. And this lady here on the right comes from a village called Chose, and she's dressed for a special festival, but again, similar to Tibet with a striped apron and a type of parak on her head, but this time with the addition of seed pearls and a beautiful silver clasp with phoenixes on it. Now, the monasteries in this part of the world are all striped, and that is because they belong to the Sakya tradition of Buddhism. So they are striped red, which is for wisdom or Manjusri, white for Avalokiteshvara or compassion, and black for Vajrapani or power. And so it's not just the monasteries, but also the Chortens. Now, this is a distinguishing characteristic of Mustang, because although you find Sakya monasteries elsewhere in the Himalayas, you don't find the whole area full of Sakya monasteries. And these were built on that money from the Salt Road. And inside, there are some beautiful mandalas and Buddhist art dating from the 15th century, some of which, as you can see today, have been damaged over time. But what happened in 1992 with the opening up of the kingdom to the outside world was that teams of international restorers have come in to advise, and they have taught the local people how to restore and conserve their works of art. Sometimes this is controversial. You have two approaches to conservation. You have the Western sort of very purist idea that you shouldn't do too much. And then you have the Buddhist approach that they want to be able to see whatever they're visualizing or meditating on. And hopefully now they have the right balance. And this is from one of the main monasteries in Lomantang. And Lomantang is the walled capital, which was built by the first king, Amepal, who the gates were closed at night to keep out brigands and wolves and evil spirits. And this was where the last king of Mustang lived. And he died in 2016, but he was able to keep his title until the abolishment of the monarchy in 2008. And what really concerned him when I visited him quite a number of years ago was the road that was being planned from China right down through Nepal. Although it made it easier for people to get objects and food from China, it also might erode their culture. But Mustang is also a fascinating place to visit, and because there are numerous caves, many of which have very early murals, and also there are remnants in the caves of the time when the Tibetan Khampa guerrillas used them as their hideouts in the 1960s, funded by the CIA, to really needle the Chinese communists and to annoy them. And so there are still sort of the odd bit of ammunition left in these caves. Now we move into the more temperate area of Sikkim, known as the Valley of Rice and as a botanical paradise. It's now absolutely tiny, as you can see here, but originally it occupied a much larger area, going into Western Nepal, coming down into West Bengal, owning Darjeeling, and also this area here, the Chumbi Valley, which you see between Sikkim and Bhutan. But gradually it has dwindled to this size. And they have two very important passes on the border with the Chumbi Valley to go into Tibet, the Jelapla and the Natula. And these were the passes which all our first sort of forays into Tibet, like the Young Husband expedition, and those people the earliest Everest mountaineers would have traveled this way. Buddhism was introduced by Padmasambhava, who gets everywhere across the Himalayas. And then it became a kingdom from 1642. And the first king was a Tibetan, but it was never actually part of Tibet. And from that date, there was a flourishing Buddhist culture. And the last king, whom you see here, first of all married a Tibetan, who died, and then an American called Hope Cook. And together they really tried to save Sikkim's independence. But in 1973, there were anti-monarchy riots. And in 1975, after a fairly controversial takeover, it was absorbed into India. And the population of Sikkim, the indigenous population, are what we call the Lepchas, animists and nature lovers. And then from the 12th, 13th century, you got the arrival of Tibetans who call themselves Bhutias, and they wear the striped Sikkimese costume and really regard themselves today as Sikkimese. And then the third part of the population is the Nepalese. Now, the Nepalese began moving into Sikkim after the Gurkhas of Nepal and Sikkim fought a war in the 18th century. And many different Nepali types, the Limbus, the Gurungs, and so on, came into Sikkim. But their population was increased quite dramatically during the time of British colonialism, in British India colonialism, who invited more Nepalese in to increase the productivity of the land. If you think, the Nepalese have always been very good at terracing mountainsides. So today, what you have is the majority of the population are Hindu, and actually 70%, I think at the last count, of the population are Nepalese. And the Nepalese tend to be both Buddhist and Hindu, but at the moment, the higher population are Hindu. And yet, there are still over 100 flourishing Buddhist monasteries with very active lamas teaching in them. But right the way across the Himalayas, the monasteries more or less follow the same format. And the most important room for all of them is what they call the Chanting Hall or the Dukan, where the monks gather at different times of day and night for communal prayers and rituals. And here you see the long horns or dungchen to call the faithful to prayer. Now, one particular characteristic of Sikkim is that they have many of their own festivals, and particularly this one in honor of their sacred deity of Kanchenjunga. So this goes back to their pre-Buddhist beliefs. And here we see two Sikkimese carrying an offering to the deity, which is called a turma, and it's made of butter, coloured butter. And the Sikkimese are wearing masks, not, I hasten to add, because of COVID, but so that they don't breathe any impure air on the offering. Now, finally, we move into Bhutan, which has never been colonized, never been part of Tibet, and is the only surviving kingdom in the Himalayas. But it was not a kingdom until 1907. Prior to that, it was a theocracy ruled over by the Shadrun lineage. It is a very beautiful country, small, about the same size as Switzerland, and Buddhism came in here with Guru Rinpoche or Padmasambhava, and there are many myths and legends about Padmasambhava. One is how he arrived here in one of his 8 emanations at Tatsang and on a pregnant tigress, and defeated the demons hostile to Buddhism. Now, Bhutan has a very diverse ethnic population, and these are just a few of the types. And there are 23 different languages in Bhutan, not just dialects, but languages. But today there's a lingua franca called Zanskar, and the main medium of instruction in schools and universities is in English. They're predominantly Buddhist, apart from the Lot Sampa, who were originally Nepalese and who are either Hindu or Christian. But they're all collectively known as Drukpa, or the Dragon People. Now, the monasteries were built the length and breadth of the country, similar to what we've seen before, but with a greater use of carved and painted wood. And by the end of the 16th century, Bhutan was a very Buddhist area. And yet it was still a collection of valleys ruled over by warring chieftains. And the Buddhist sects that had come down from Tibet were constantly rivaling one another. So there was no unity in the land until the arrival of Shadrun Nawang Namgyal, a reincarnate Lama from Tibet who fled his homeland because of political power struggles. And he arrived in Bhutan in 1616, and he established a dual government run on sacred and secular lines. And he made his form of Buddhism, the Drukpa Kagyu, the state religion. But what is most as important is he brought peace to the country and unity for the first time in its history. And he's probably best known for the chain of dzongs he built throughout the land. Now, we've seen similar with the Lay Palace, but these are spectacular examples. And they're not only for defense, but they house the sacred and secular administration of each area. And they have become very much an identifying symbol of Bhutan. And in the 17th century, Tibet attacked Bhutan several times. And this made the Shadrun realize that if Bhutan was going to remain independent, he had to somehow make it different from Tibet, even though they shared the same culture and the same religion. So he initiated a code of conduct or behavior called Driglam Namsa. And this included rules on what people should wear. And the man's costume of the go dates from this time, the knee-length robe, as does the kabne or ceremonial shawl. And status was indicated by the length of the hem and also by the color of the kabne. For instance, ordinary ceremonial scarves are white or cream, or if you are a king, your scarf is yellow, and so on. Now, also around the same time, the female dress of the kira is introduced. But I really want to mention this because the weaving that you find in Bhutan is highly sophisticated and unparalleled elsewhere across the Himalayas. They're really beautiful, and something like this would take about a year to make. And they are what we call one of the 13 arts and crafts of Bhutan, which was also initiated by the Shadrun to try and focus on arts and crafts which were different from Tibet or had different characteristics. So, for example, in the paintings today, you often find a little Bhutanese scene, a Bhutanese house, ladies in Bhutanese dress. And another thing that's different in Bhutan is their domestic architecture. Very different style of architecture, originally with wooden shingle roofs, made of stone, wood and rammed earth, and with Buddhist emblems painted on the exterior, the Garuda, a deer, and yes, this is a part of the male anatomy, which is considered highly auspicious. And also often on the houses, you see chili drying, and chili is their national dish, emadatsi or chili and cheese. And so that's something that's very different from the rest of the Himalayas. And incidentally, over 70% of Bhutan's land at the moment is forested because of their very well thought out environment policy. By the 19th century, the Shadrun lineage had weakened and there were power struggles in the country. And after the 5th Shadrun had died, they decided on a monarchy. And this began the hereditary monarchy of the Wangchuks. The first 2 kings brought peace and stability to the area. The 3rd king is regarded as the father of modern day Bhutan because he began to develop his country with India's assistance, and most importantly of all, joined the United Nations in 1971. And the 4th king has really done his utmost to, really protect and preserve Bhutan's identity, and particularly their cultural identity. They said, we have an army, but we don't have the military might to destroy either India or China. But what we do have is our very unique culture. So he started schools and institutes across the land, specializing in the 13 arts and crafts of Bhutan. And also what you find right the way across the Himalayas is the monastic dance or cham, which again, I think has reached a very high sophistication in Bhutan itself. And they have certain dances which relate more to Bhutanese Buddhism than Tibet. Now, the 4th king is also responsible for coining the phrase gross national happiness, measuring, the happiness of his people rather than the gross national product, which sort of took off around the world. And by the early 2000s, he thought what was really needed was democracy in his country. He'd lessened the power of the monarchy. He'd done what he could to preserve Bhutan's culture and keeping up the same traditions that the Shadrun had initiated. So he decided to abdicate, very unusually, in 2006, and he handed over power to his son in 2008. And his son carries on the leadership with the same understanding and the same really enlightened attitude. Now, another thing that you find in Bhutan are square chalkmans. which you don't find elsewhere. But I really show you this picture because it's 108 Chortens looking out across the Himalayas to Tibet, which was once, if you like, their spiritual heartland originally. But today, of course, Tibet is very different. There's cultural and environmental destruction. And so, you know, and various human rights problems, many. So if we look at the map of what we have seen this afternoon, what we have seen is that all these countries were originally more or less left relatively in peace because of their geographical inaccessibility. Also, in part, because of their connection to Tibet, but also because they were like a buffer state between the world's superpowers of British India, Russia, and China. And once things started to move with the Great Game, and once things started to move with China taking over Tibet, you know, gradually all these little kingdoms began to crumble, or indeed crumbled earlier, or became part of their larger neighbours. And the only one that didn't was Bhutan, because I think she was fully aware of what had happened in Tibet and realised that that was time to open up to the outside world. So although, you know, we have seen many differences, small differences, I think what unites these different areas is their environment and their reverence for the environment and their pre-Buddhist culture. But above all, how it is Buddhism and the practice of their faith that has united them all. And yes, there are differences, particularly in Ladakh and in Bhutan, but the similarities that unite them are far greater than the differences that separate them. And of course, you know, when I first visited these areas, they were mainly quite remote. They were self-sufficient. They didn't have, you know, any modernization. You know, that nothing was wasted, nothing was thrown away. They ate what they produced. And of course, now they've really been catapulted at great speed into the modern world with consumerism, tourism, social media, all manner of things, which have undoubtedly, you know, started to erode their culture. But I definitely, you know, still going back to these places, I'm always amazed by their resilience and by, you know, their deep belief and their pride in their cultures. And, you know, one thing that hasn't changed is the sort of undeniable beauty of the Himalayas themselves. And on that note, I'd like to end. I'm sorry it was a bit of a gallop, but I hope I haven't overrun too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zara. I hope people can hear me. We've had a few questions, not just during the lecture, but also before the lecture. Maybe I can just throw some of these at you, if that's okay. An interesting one: to what extent is Buddhism still the dominant religion in the region?
Okay, you really need to do it slightly region by region. In Ladakh now, Upper Ladakh is still very Buddhist and the dominant religion, but actually the overall population of Ladakh is now more Muslim. But then Islam has been in Ladakh for a very long time, thinking back to the trade route, and also in the 17th century, you know, actually a mosque was built in Ladakh. But at the moment, you know, they coexist very well. And I have to say that the monasteries in Ladakh all seem at the moment to be very flourishing. There are many good teachers, which have meant that more and more young people have come in to listen. And interestingly, although social media has sort of negative impacts, often this has enabled the youngsters to actually, you know, pick up their phones and listen to Buddhist teachings, which is quite a new thing for them. Lahoul, more or less, mostly Hindu today. Spiti, still strongly Tibet or Buddhist, especially because the Dalai Lama often visits there. Mustang, predominantly Buddhist, but I have to say it's more of an aging population now in Mustang, with many of the younger generation heading down to Kathmandu for work. And so you don't get the monasteries so full in Mustang. Sikkim, it's still active because of the teachers and lamas themselves. But as I said in the talk, you know, it's now, the Hindu population has now taken over. And Bhutan, you know, it's definitely flourished to a very large extent, even though, again, there are Nepalese and Christians in the country.
I suppose linked to that a little bit is, do any of these areas have anything to learn from Bhutan?
It's probably too late for them to learn from Bhutan, although having said that, I think Bhutan has been very successful for various reasons. I think originally it was almost a bit of self-isolation, keeping people out. Yes, they had trade routes, but they didn't like outsiders too much. But then again, nor did Tibet. But I think they took the right step. They chose the right moment, having seen what had happened in Tibet, to open up to the outside world and develop with India's assistance. And I think what is really interesting about Bhutan today is that they're a very successful constitutional monarchy, and their constitution has, you know, is enormously positive for the environment. They're not only carbon neutral, they're carbon negative. The hydroelectric power, the water power which they have in Bhutan, you know, supplies hydroelectric power to India and is their main economy, really. But they have also, you know, really thought about the environment, keeping in the constitution over 60% of their land is forested. Also, they have their policy of gross national happiness, which, you know, okay, it took off around the world, but everything that they do in government is thinking about what benefits the people most, not what benefits their economy. And so I think there are lessons to be learned from Bhutan, and they are, it's not Shangri-La, you know, there are still problems, but I think they've managed to get the right balance between their traditions and, you know, moving cautiously into the modern world.
And I suppose another question slightly related to that, and maybe you've covered it, is, but some countries cannot remain as museums.
No, they definitely can't.
Driving.
But I think mostly what I totally agree. People, you know, countries shouldn't remain as museums. And, you know, there's often the temptation as a tourist to hope things stay the same as ever and don't have big hotels built and things like that. And actually, I think, you know, the countries that I've mentioned today, they really have, Buddhism is a living culture, particularly in Bhutan. And also there's no high-rise buildings in Bhutan. There's no sort of McDonald's or Starbucks or anything like that in Bhutan. So they can't be museums, they can't be static. They must be allowed to sort of breathe and live.
Then in Sikkim, another question we had was what really happened in the takeover of Sikkim by India?
That's quite a long question and quite a difficult one because it's controversial. I think what happened in Sikkim is, as I said, the population in Sikkim grew with Nepalese who had come there from the 18th century, but it grew dramatically. And so, in a sense, it was to India's advantage that the overwhelming population in Sikkim was actually Hindu. Now, India really needed Sikkim. They needed, you know, for their northern border. They've got China to the north. Tibet was already taken over, and they were worried about their northern neighbor. I think, from my point of view, I think they could have managed it in a very different way. You know, but they didn't. And I think they used the constitution and the voting, which so many Hindus voted to abolish the monarchy. I think, but having said that, you know, Sikkim today, there is the daughter of the last king lives in Sikkim, and she's done an enormous amount for the preservation of, Sikkim's Buddhist cultural heritage. It's a very long story, and there are many books you can read about it, not least something called Smash and Grab.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we did have a question about what is the claim to end occupation of Tibet based on?
Gosh, all these politics. Okay. You have to think of, when I showed you the map with Tibet to the north, during the Great Game, which was really, especially 19th century, but even really began in the 18th century, you've got these great powers of China, Russia, and British India, all vying for supremacy, if you like, on the roof of the world. Tibet was that neutral bit in the middle. And so they each maybe didn't want to occupy Tibet, but they wanted to be, to move across that area. The British originally thought that Russia was coming down into India, and when we sent in the Young Husband mission, we thought that the Russians were hiding missiles of mass destruction. So that was the Great Game. So yes, China wanted, to be the supreme one. Secondly, it's a vast area, Tibet, and it is full of natural resources which had never been tapped because of their pre-Buddhist beliefs of not disturbing the ground and respect for the environment. And so, it's incredibly rich in so many minerals. And, I mentioned the salt lakes as sources for lithium, for batteries, and so many, copper, gold, silver, so much is there in Tibet. And I think that is the main reason. And also it was a very empty space, and China has a very large population. And the claim, I think, is too long. I'd need another lecture.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. Zara, thank you very much. I mean, we're moving from the cultural to the geopolitical in a number of questions. Maybe that isn't the lecture, but thank you very much indeed. That's been a wonderful lecture. And I think maybe there's a chance for everyone to express their thanks for you, but thank you very much. That's been great.
Thank you.